Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the operator meeting today. My name is Hannah Hickam, and I will be your host. And I don't think we have any announcements, so we can just get started. Jane, can you tell me which of your presentations is the first to go? I've got confidential info and op meeting August 30th.
Yeah, the other one, not the confidential. We'll do that. I'll do that after I plow through that big one.
Perfect. Just a moment, please.
Thanks, Hannah.
Welcome. All right, you can take it away.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Jane Stanzik, and I've got some screenshots of the Form 3, which is the financial assurance plan, which is about to be beta tested, but we're not quite there. But I'm going to walk you through everything so you can see what it looks like, and you can be preparing the information that you'll need to complete your Form 3 as soon as we get this released. Next slide, please, Hannah. So it's in the new eForm system on the upper left there. That's where you click on the home page to get to the new eForm system. You use your web forms username and password to log in, and when you log in, you're just going to click File Online for a Form 3. Next slide. When you get in there, the Form 3 has all of these sections. Remember, the new eForms has sections instead of tabs, and they're listed vertically like this. Those 3 sections that are grayed out will be available once you have gotten to the plan options section and you've selected an option. Then you'll be able, you'll see that those other sections are available. Next slide, please, Hannah. So this is the basic operator information section. Initial plan will be automatically checked because that's all anyone can file right now, and we're still working on developing the revised plans that folks will need down the road. Next slide, please, Hannah. This is also on that in the operator information section. If your plan requires a hearing, you're going to enter the docket number here. Staff will enter the commission order later. And we are auto-populating the lists of subsidiary operators. If you're a parent operator filing this Form 3, these will be presented. The form will use all of the data from your subsidiary operators in all of the calculations and totals, everything. It's going to be the parent plus subsidiaries. You cannot edit your subsidiary operators here in the Form 3. If what you see here doesn't look right, you're going to need to file another Form 1C to add or delete subsidiary operators. That text box at the bottom is grayed out for the initial form. It'll be available for a revised form. Next slide, Hannah. Transfer of ownership. This box obviously isn't necessary for the initial form, but will be available on a Form 3 that's sent in for a transfer. But here's the big part of the form is the production data and plan options. So all of this data will be auto-populated, and of course your average daily per well production is what determines your plan options. You'll need to select yes or no as to whether or not you're a public company or a private company. Your current plan option will be auto-populated in the future when you're submitting a revised form. Next slide, please, Hannah. So then there's the Weld data section. The first part is just a summary of all of your wells. This is all auto-populated. You don't have to do anything. Again, it's a summary of your wells by status. It shows just the numbers of the total number, the number of wells with that status that have federal financial assurance, the number that are tribal, and then the remaining number which are subject to your financial assurance plan. And remember, the wells with federal financial assurance, that's based on the information you've submitted on a Form 3B. So these are the wells by status. Next slide, please, Hannah. And right below that are the wells by designation, same kind of summary. And then you can view the well data. So this is just a summary. These are totals. If you click on that button, you'll see all of the wells, and so you can check on the totals. Next slide, please, Hannah. And this is what it looks like when you open the view well data. It just lists all the wells, whether or not they have federal financial assurance or they're tribal, and their status and their designation. And you can do all kinds of filtering on this. But again, it's just there for you to see the input that's being used for your form. Next slide, please, Hannah. And the next section of the well data is the inactive well list. So that there's a total there, and then there's an associated list with it, which you are going to take action on this, whereas those other two lists, there's no action for you to take. They're just there for your information. This is required by rule that for all of the wells on your inactive well list, that you provide the reason for no production, the planned return to production date, if there is one, or your planned plugging date. So this is not a template. It's not a download a list, work on it, and upload it. You're going to be entering this information in this list within the form. Next slide, please, Hannah. So here's a little help for you to get ready to do that. Now that we have defined inactive as part of the COGCC search, you can search for all of your defined inactive wells. Parent operators, you're going to want to run a search for your wells and for all of your consolidated subsidiary operators. Next slide, please, Hannah. When you run this search, it takes you to this page with the results, and you can export the results to Excel, and then you can work on preparing the responses that you need for your inactive wells. So back to the form. Those are just a couple slides for how to get ready. Next slide, please, Hannah. This is data that's totally auto-populated. You don't have to do anything, but it's within the well data section. It's just your plugging history for the last 3 calendar years. So we're providing data for this year because it depends on where you are in the current year, whether it's almost done or it's a long time ago. This next part, the asset retirement planning, it's required on every form. There's a rule reference there if you want to go read it. It's likely that this is going to qualify for confidentiality. And if that's the case, you won't put all the information here. You will prepare an attachment that will be checked as confidential. So you will have to put a statement in here that it's confidential and you've provided it as an attachment. Next slide, please, Hannah. And this is some more information that's going to be auto-populated, and you can view a list if you want to see exactly what's going on with your individual wells. The reason this is here is that wells that have been plugged, and that means they have a status of DA or PA in the database, or a designation of RP, which is reported plugged, they are all excluded from all of the lists and the calculations for financial assurance. So this data is provided to give you and staff and the commission some information about the operators' plugged wells that have not been fully reclaimed, as it's just something to be considered in approving a plan. Next slide, please, Hannah. So this is the financial assurance types and bond writers section. You'll be filling out all of this information. And there's a note on here that if you are going to provide any of those alternative types of financial assurance, that you'll have to file a hearing application, that your plan requires commission approval. And again, there's rule references there for you to check back to see what all this relates to. Next slide, please, Hannah. So this is the plan options section. When you build your form, the form will automatically determine what plan options you are eligible for based on your wells and your production. And it will also calculate the amount of financial assurance for any options that you are eligible for. And it'll populate it right here. So then from here, you will check, it says select one option to proceed. So you'll check that, that radio button in front of option 6 or in front of option 1. And then that's the plan that you'll complete within the form. Next slide, please, Hannah. So now I'm going to walk through all these options. So I've combined options 1 and 2 because they're pretty much the same, except that the percent of threshold for the number of low producing wells that can be included within the per blanket financial assurance. So for option 1, it's 10%. For option 2, it's 5%. So everything here is auto-populated. You can open, view those lists to see exactly which wells are that the form has auto-populated and auto-calculated for. So in looking at the low producing wells, under the threshold, the wells are included in options 1 and 2 in the per well blanket financial assurance. Over the threshold requires single well financial assurance. So the way this is auto-populated and calculated by the form is the single well financial assurance is calculated for every low producing well. And then those wells are ordered from the most expensive single well financial assurance to the least expensive. And then the threshold in this example of 307, the form will take the 307 most expensive single well financial assurance wells and put them in the per well blanket. So you won't be paying those most expensive single well financial assurances. You'll be covered by the per well amount based on your option and your eligibility within that option. So next slide, Hannah. So for single well financial assurance, the rules give operators the option of providing demonstrated costs for single well financial assurance calculations. You can look in the 100 series at the definition of single well financial assurance. It provides for the operator's demonstrated costs, and then it shows the COGCC costs, which I apologize, I was going to add to this slide and I forgot, but they're in the 100 series. If you have developed your own costs, you choose to use them, you have to enter them here, and you have to enter all 4 values. So there's the plugging costs in 3 buckets by the TVD at the total depth of the well, and then the location reclamation costs. If you do provide them, you have to provide supporting evidence for those costs, and that's an attachment, and that most likely will qualify for confidentiality. Next slide, please, Hannah. So here are the low producing wells that are over the threshold. So in this case, in this test data, the operator had 307 wells that were below the threshold, but low producing wells, but then had 68 that were over the threshold. And for these, the requirement is single well financial assurance. So the form calculates that amount and enters it here. It'll enter the amount. The first amount is using the COGCC costs, and the second is using the operator demonstrated costs if they're provided. In this test data, I didn't check the box, so it's not in there. And you can click on that view low producing wells to see which ones will have single well financial assurance. In the future, an option 1 and 2 operator may have single well financial assurance required for out of service wells. Right now, for everyone's initial plans, these do not exist. But when they do, they'll be pulled in here and you'll be able to look at the list. I've got the rule there so you can look at the instances, the circumstances that would result in an operator having these. Next slide, please, Hannah. The same thing is true for the possibility of other financial assurance for out of service wells. Again, there's a rule reference and you can check that out. The form will total up all of the financial assurance required for wells and put that total right there. All Form 3s require a certification of financial capability, and that's an attachment that's signed by a corporate officer. This document is intended to be a public-facing document, so it will not be confidential. Okay. That's the end of options 1 and 2. Next slide, please, Hannah. So here I'm doing, we're going to do options 3 and 4 together because they're almost the same. Again, if you're using demonstrated costs, you have to attach your supporting evidence. The options 3 and 4, remember, have single well financial assurance for all wells. So the form will calculate that value and put it in there. Next slide, please, Hannah. There will be, again, in the future, the possibility for option 3 and 4 operators to have other financial assurance for low producing wells and to have other for out of service wells. And there are the rule references for you to check that out. But that's not going to happen in your initial plan. Next slide, please, Hannah. So this is where the differences are between options 3 and options 4. So options 3 and 4 have contributed financial assurance, which means you're required to provide a percent of your total wells financial assurance responsibility annually. And the difference between 3 and 4 is that for option 3, it's 5% of the total every year, and for option 4, it's 10% of the total. So that'll be calculated here. In both options, an operator has the ability to request a modified annual contribution amount, something other than what's calculated right above there. So if you're choosing to do that, you'll enter the amount there, and the form will calculate what percent of the total that represents. And this would trigger the requirement for a commission hearing for your plan if you choose to use a modified or propose a modified annual contribution. And again, a certification of financial capabilities required for options 3 and 4. Next slide, please, Hannah. Here's option 5. Option 5 is the option where the operator proposes an amount of financial assurance for their wells based on the status or on the designation. And so the form has a list, an auto-populated list that you're going to open by clicking Set Financial Assurance Types for Wells. So when you open it, it lists all of your wells, and it shows the current status and the current designation. And you, in this list, are going to use those radio buttons to say, for this well, it's based on status, or for this well, it's based on well designation. So again, the status and designation are provided for you, and you're going to select whatever you've decided you want to use for that well. Again, this is within the form. It's not a template. It's in there. You just work within the form. And the developer's done you a big favor. He's given you a button to hide completed wells. So as you work through this and save it and maybe come back to this, it'll help you finish it up by hiding the ones that are completed. And also you can filter on all the columns in this list within the form. Next slide, please, Hannah. So once you've done that, the form will summarize here the number of wells that you have for each status and the number that you've selected in that list to have their financial assurance based on their status. You will enter the amount of per well financial assurance you're proposing to pay based on each of the statuses. So that column you'll have to fill in within the form for all of the statuses, and then the form will auto calculate then the total financial assurance by that status based on that list where you hit the radio button for the wells. Next slide, please, Hannah. This is a similar summary of the wells that you've selected by designation. So again, you will have to enter the amount of per well financial assurance by designation. The form will add it all up and give you the total amount. Next slide, please, Hannah. The rules require that you describe circumstances under which single well financial assurance will be provided for future low producing wells. Again, for single well financial assurance, you can elect to provide your demonstrated costs. Next slide, please, Hannah. And all of these things could, like with the other options, these are scenarios that could develop in the future. They won't be applicable to your initial plan, but down the road they could happen. So again, I've given you rule references for you to look at to understand when this could happen, how and when. Next slide, please, Hannah. This is a section that will be totally auto-populated and auto-calculated. You can look at the rule to see, but it's essentially comparing what you've selected as when you select to be an option, to have an option 5 plan. You're also, by virtue of your average daily per well production, you're eligible for another option. I mean, you just are. And this will calculate, if you were to go with that other option rather than option 5, this calculates what the financial assurance for your low producing wells would be with that other option. And this is to provide the commission with a comparison of what you're proposing as option 5 and what the you'd be required with the other option you're eligible for. But you don't have to do it, the form will do it itself, but it's part of the evaluation of your plan. Next slide, please, Hannah. These are things that are required for an option 5 plan. There's a text box that you can fill it in, or if that's not enough space, you can prepare an attachment. And then at the bottom, like with the other options, the certification of financial capability is required. In addition, for option 5, it says that you will include your current net worth as demonstrated through financial statements accompanied by an unmodified opinion issued by an independent auditor. That is more than likely a confidential document, and the name that for that attachment is the audited financial statements, and that's a separate attachment to be prepared separate from the certification of financial capability. So these are the extra requirements for option 5. Next slide, please, Hannah. So here's option 6, which is similar to options 1 and 2. There's a threshold based on the total number of wells, and the wells under that threshold can be included in the operator's comprehensive financial assurance, blanket financial assurance. So this is similar to options 1 and 2. Next slide, please, Hannah. Again, there could be single well financial assurance required, so option 6 operators can elect to provide demonstrated cost for that. So if the operator has more low producing wells than the 25% threshold, those wells will have single well financial assurance. Again, the form will automatically select the ones with the lowest cost, calculated costs. And then for the future, there could be single well financial assurance for out of service wells. Next slide, please, Hannah. Other financial assurance for out of service or other financial assurance for out of service wells, just like all the other options. Then the form totals it up, and the certification of financial capability is attached. Next slide, please, Hannah. So I've gone through all the options for the wells. The Form 3 will also include the financial assurance for things that aren't wells. So this section will be auto-populated from the database, and the amount of financial assurance will be auto-calculated using the new amounts in the rules. So for individual, the possible facilities are E&P waste facilities, gas facilities, produced water transfer systems, and commercial UIC disposal facilities. And so whatever's in the database, these will be listed and calculated. It's possible that you have blanket bonds for seismic operations and for gas facilities, and those will be listed and calculated and then totaled up at the bottom. Next slide, please, Hannah. The other non-well financial assurance is for remediation projects and for surface owner protection bonds. So again, whatever you currently have will be listed, and if there's a new amount, it'll be calculated for it. And as with other sections that are completely auto-populated and calculated, you can view the list to see what is in the database and what's being used to calculate the financial assurance. Next slide, please, Hannah. This summarizes everything within the form. It's all done for you. Next slide, please, Hannah. The form has an attachment section, and it works, similar to our old e-forms and now our web forms. And there will be a box for you to select confidential for certain attachments. And my next presentation is going to talk about that whole thing. Next slide, please, Hannah. And here's a list of all the attachments for the Form 3. Next slide, please, Hannah. So just going through this, here are the things, since the form is not released yet, these are all the things that you can be doing right now to get ready to file your Form 3. If you need to consolidate subsidiaries as a parent operator, you can file a Form 1C. If you have wells for which you've provided financial assurance to the federal government, you need to file a Form 3B for those wells, so that this Form 3 will see that and exclude them from the requirements of financial assurance paid to the state. You can determine your financial assurance types, your bond writer information. You can determine your option eligibility. Chris is going to show you what's going to be available hopefully later today on the website that shows our calculation of your average daily per well production for the previous 12 months, which is what determines your options. You can work on your inactive well list information. There were a couple slides that showed how to do a search in COGCC to get the list of them. And remember that the things that you have to provide are the reason for no production and either a planned return to production date or planned plugging date for all your inactive wells. If you're going to use your demonstrated costs for single well financial assurance, you can be preparing the amounts for all 3 depth brackets as well as for the reclamation costs for the location. And you can prepare your attachment for the supporting evidence for those demonstrated costs. And you can also prepare the other 2 attachments that everyone needs, and that's the certification of financial capability and the asset retirement planning document. And if you need to have a hearing, you'll be working on your hearing application. Next slide, please, Hannah. Option 3 and 4 operators would be considering a modified annual contribution amount if you're going to take that route. And then option 5 operators need to determine for all of their wells whether they're going to be, the financial assurance will be determined by their status or by their designation, and as well as the amounts of per well financial assurance based on status and based on designation. And then the option 5 justification and the option 5 factors are also will be required, as well as the audited financial statements attachment. I think that's my last slide, Hannah. Oh, it sure is. That's all I have. I guess we're going to do questions at the end, right, Hannah?
Yes, folks, you can just chat your questions and as they come to you, and we'll read them all and go and answer them at the end. And do you want me to move on to the next presentation?
Yes, please, Hannah.
And that's the confidential info, is that correct?
Yes.
All right, there you go.
Thanks. You can just go to the first slide.
Great.
So Rule 223 provides for confidential information. 223B12 is what applies to your financial assurance. And it says non-public and confidential financial information submitted as part of a plan or a demonstration of costs for single well financial assurance. So looking at this rule and looking at the Form 3, the financial assurance plan, there are 3 attachments that will qualify as confidential. The asset retirement planning, the audited financial statements, that's only for option 5, and supporting evidence for demonstrated costs for any operator that wants to use their costs for single well financial assurance. Next slide, please, Hannah. So the asset retirement planning attachment, it's required by rule, and it can, in the form, that information can be entered as a text in the text field, or it can be an attachment. Only attachments can be confidential. Information in the form itself cannot be confidential. So if your asset retirement planning information meets the requirements for confidentiality, you will just enter a statement that it's confidential, and then you will provide that information as an attachment. Next slide, please, Hannah. So the audited financial statements attachment for option 5, in this, the red text the information in the red text is what this attachment will be. So the audited financial statements is separate from the certification of financial capability. As I mentioned before, talking about the certification of financial capability, that's intended to be a public-facing document, but certainly net worth and financial statements and the results of the independent auditor. If you are a private company, that is certainly confidential information. So you're going to prepare a separate attachment called Audited Financial Statements to provide that information, and you can check it as confidential. Next slide, please, Hannah. The SBP provides that, first of all, it explains what the supporting evidence is. If an operator, if you're choosing to provide your costs for single well financial assurance, the expectation for the supporting evidence for what those numbers are, those dollar amounts, the SBP suggests that it's invoices or third-party estimates. The SBP also says that that is most likely confidential information. And so if that's the case, your supporting evidence for the costs would be confidential. So that's an attachment. The costs themselves are not confidential. Next slide, please, Hannah. So the certification of financial capability, it's required for all the options. I've put the rules in there for you to see. It's an attachment because it's a signed document. We need to see it. For option 5, it's separate from the attachment I just described for the audited financial statements. This is meant to be a public-facing document, and there's no need for it to contain information that would qualify as confidential. Next slide, please, Hannah. And again, as I've mentioned, for the demonstrated costs, the actual dollar amounts that you're going to provide, if you choose to be used to calculate your single well financial assurance, it's provided for in the Series 100 definition. And any operator, again, it's all options. Can you put this in? The costs themselves are entered in the form because they're used to calculate. They're not an attachment, and they don't qualify for confidentiality. They are the basis for the amount of financial assurance that is required for your wells. That's not something that's confidential. Next slide, please, Hannah. So, actually, can you go to the next slide, Hannah? Okay, so I maybe should have put this first in this whole presentation, sorry. Rule 223A, number 1 through 3, provides the process for handling confidential information. And it says that if you have information that you think qualifies for confidentiality, that you provide it to the director, and the director determines whether or not, in fact, it should be confidential. And what this presentation is actually, sorry, I did get the cart before the horse. The whole purpose for this presentation is to provide essentially a shortcut to that process. So Hannah, if you can go back to the slide right before this. So these 3 documents, more than likely, for all operators, will meet the requirement for confidentiality. So what we're providing right now is a shortcut that jumps over this step of you have to provide the information to the director, and then the director decides. We're saying, yes, your asset retirement planning, your audited financial statements, and the supporting evidence for demonstrated costs, those things are more than likely going to be confidential. And so rather than having to send that to staff and have a determination, we're just saying, this is what you're going to do. So you're going to, and again, the rule that's cited here is 223A3. You're going to prepare and attach a redacted document attachment. You're going to prepare and attach a confidential document. The non-redacted one, that confidential one, will be labeled confidential within the document, right at the top of the document itself. And then within the Form 3, you're going to check the confidential box for that confidential document. So this means that you don't have to provide it to staff and go through those steps for determining confidentiality. If you have something other than these 3 attachments that you think should be confidential, then you will need to use the process provided in the rule. So Hannah, now can you go to that next slide? And so here's the process. You send the document or documents to the finance manager. You clearly identify within the document or in the email whatever you think qualifies for confidentiality, and then staff will make that determination and respond to your email. So we're just saying right up front that clearly those 3 attachments will qualify as confidential, and we've just set up the form for you to submit it with that. I think that's the last slide in this little presentation, Hannah. Oh, no, it's not. Oh my gosh. So if you look at the rules where it talks about your inactive well list and your asset retirement planning, in option 1, that 702D1, that's option 1. And it says that you enter the information that we've already talked about in your inactive well list. Options 2 through 6, that information is repeated as being required in your asset retirement planning document. But you don't need to repeat it. You're going to enter that within your Form 3 in that list within the form. You don't need to repeat it in your retirement planning. And obviously this is a candidate for a rule cleanup. So please don't think you have to do that. Just you're going to put it in the form, in the list. Next slide, please, Hannah. Oh, and here's just the list of the attachments. So you'll see that you'll be able to select when you name your attachments, you identify which one is confidential and which one is redacted, and that's the one that will be public. And the confidential one is where you're going to check the box in the form for it to be protected. And I do think that's my last slide. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Jane. We do have a few questions in the chat, so I'll just maximize my.
But I think, but Christopher has.
Oh, okay. Chris, do you have stuff to present as well?
Yeah, I've got a couple slides to share here.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm done. Thanks.
Sorry, Hannah, just trying to get this to work. Okay, hopefully everyone can see my screen. Thank you, Jane. That was fantastic overview of the Form 3 and an update on confidentiality. As Jane mentioned, one of the key components of the Form 3 is determining your option eligibility. And a couple folks in the information group have helped put together a tool outside of the Form 3 that will allow you to check your option eligibility. And this will be available in the COGCC tool set. And if you go to our homepage and you go to data and then the COGCC database, you'll see an option under the inquiry list for operator name, address, and financial assurance. When you click on that, you will then put in your operator ID, operator number or name, and then you will have you will see a page with your company detail. And it includes some information about the financial assurance plan that you can link to. You'll see a button there that says previous 12 months production data. And when you click on that, it will take you to a page with a table that has the calculated values using the correct 12-month production window for the financial assurance plan option eligibility determination. And so you'll see basically the values for your production, what your aggregate GOR is, what your GOR determination would be, what unit, whether it's BOE or MCFE. And then finally, there'll be an average daily per well production calculation in both BOE and MCFE. And then your plan option that you're eligible for, which will be an option 1 through 4 for every operator. And then some operators will have the option to file under option 6, which will, there's different thresholds depending on if you're private or public. So that information is just shown for you right there. There's also on this page a button that you can click on that allows you to export your monthly production on a well by well basis. That would allow you to actually recreate the calculation that's used for the option eligibility determination in the Form 3. And so you'll get a spreadsheet like this, again, for the correct previous 12-month window. And you can use that in combination with the calculation diagram that we put together several months ago. If you start with step number 8 in this and follow it through using that monthly production export, you should be able to recreate exactly the values that you see in the Form 3. So hopefully that will be a useful tool. And we, as Jane said, we hope to have this available this afternoon So an operator, anyone can see what their option eligibility will be. So that's it. Thank you, Hannah.
Great, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Jane. We can go ahead and get started on the questions. I just want to put my little presentation back up real quick. And these are the upcoming dates, although we can take today's date off, huh? All right, first question is, will out-of-service wells be excluded from the inactive well list?
Yes. Out of service is out of service.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jane. And this next one's long. I'm just going to read through the whole thing and hopefully you can answer. Thank you for the presentation. Will the other financial assurance tab in the Form 3 include subsidiary operators? At a prior training, operators were instructed to file Form 3As for each subsidiary operator as to non-wells. But if the non-well financial assurance is included in the Form 3 for subs, perhaps a Form 3A covering the parent's total obligation may be possible for efficiency if acceptable to the commission. The rules not providing for parent sub consolidation as to non-well FA is understood. Just please looking for clarity regarding whether the Form 3 will include subsidiaries is non-well FA. Thank you very much.
Holy cow! I can't even think that long. So there's a bunch in there in the middle that I don't understand, but yes, previously we said that the Form 3, when it comes to the non-well financial assurance, would only have that information for the parent company. And as we're developing the form, we decided that it's going to include the parent and the subsidiaries. So that's the Form 3. The question had some reference to Form 3A. 3A is a whole different thing. And most likely operators will be filing multiple 3As. But for the Form 3, it is going to be all included. And again, you know, the list that the form will generate that shows each of those non-well facilities and the required financial assurance will help you break that all out. And, you know, what I do need to mention one thing I forgot to put on the slide for the non-well information or financial assurance. And also for the wells. The Form 3 is just going to show what is required. It doesn't take into any consideration the financial assurance that an operator has already provided to the commission. That's going to get all worked out with the 3A. So.
And I think the gist of the question, Jane, is what you settled on, and that is that we are consolidating all the information in the plan in the Form 3. But when it comes to providing the instruments of financial assurance, we have to do that by the individual operator ID so that it's associated in the database in case you sell that operator, right? Or that operator gets something different, right? There's no way to associate the data in the database for the instruments, for the financial assurance instruments, except by the individual operator ID. So we aren't able to provide a consolidation option for those operators that have multiple subsidiaries when it comes to the Form 3A. That information will all have to be submitted by the individual operator ID. And I think that was the gist of the question.
Thanks, Scott.
All right, I think the next question is, Can someone in your department create a completed Form 3 so be used as a sample? I believe they're asking for a PDF image of a completed Form 3 on the new form.
You know, that isn't really a practical thing. So much of the Form 3 is going to be auto-populated based on your data. And in the new e-forms, the PDFs look quite a bit different than we're used to in web forms and the old e-forms. I think that when you go in and start building a 3, it's so automatic. It'll just fill it out for you practically. And I tried to identify just now in this presentation all the information that you will need to enter. And I tried to show you what it's going to look like where you enter it. I don't think a sample would be any more helpful. So the answer is no, sorry.
Yeah, it's not real practical. I agree, Jane. And I would agree that, you know, if your options are not a 5 and not an altered 3 or 4, it's going to be a really straightforward process. If you're doing an option 5, or if you're wanting to change the prescribed contribution amounts, annual contribution amounts for a plan 3 or 4, all of those are going to have a hearing, and we're trying to collect the information that's needed to prep for that hearing. But you still would have to file a hearing application. And this, you know, and your Form 3 experience may not be as simple as if you had a simpler selection. So, but if you're a 1, 2, a non-modified 3, 4, or a 6, that you're going to swim through this form.
6s do go to hearing,
right?
But the form itself is boom.
And I would just add that as far as guidance goes, this presentation that Jane just gave that we'll make available today, that will be there. In addition, we will continue to provide more screen captures and specific guidance to walk you through it. So hopefully that will be sufficient in place of an actual PDF of a final Form 3.
Thanks, everybody. Let's see. The next question is, if our username and password isn't working, how can we get that information?
You can send me an email or try to give me a call. Hopefully, if you're in our system, it's an easy process to get you your credentials reset.
Great, thank you, Chris. Let's see, does option 3 allow the operator to select a demonstrated cost?
All the options, that's available to every operator.
Thank you, Jane. Will this presentation be available on website? When will this presentation be available on website?
We will make this available today. Hopefully, even by noon. It might be early afternoon.
All right, and will we have to fill out a new Form 3 every year?
It depends. A new Form 3 is necessary whenever the operator's circumstances have changed to the degree that the existing approved plan doesn't cover everything, or maybe the operator has changed option eligibility since it's based on your production. So it all depends. You need to read the rules and keep coming to operator meetings. But yeah, there are different scenarios where a revised Form 3 is required. And, you know, as I said at the beginning, What's going to be released now is the initial Form 3, and then we will develop the revised forms to meet the different circumstances that would require a revised plan. And so there'll be more meetings that will explain all of that.
Great, thank you, Jane. And then the follow-up to that is, so if we plug wells, then we need to redo the next year.
You might need to. It depends on the plan that your initial plan approval and your option, whether plugging wells means that you'd have less liability.
And also whether or not the wells you're plugging were on an out of service list, right? That's one of the
Right.
advantages of submitting an out of service or designating a well as out of service is it's excluded from the Form 3 process. And as you plug those wells, you know, they just come off your out of service list and go to plugged and abandoned, and there's no change to your plan.
Well, they're only out of service wells are only excluded for options 1, 2, and 6 operators.
That's right. I forgot that. Thanks, Jane.
Yeah. So 3, 4, and 5, they're still in there. And remember, out of service wells are designated by submitting a Form 6A.
All right, thanks. The next question is, once all the data is entered in a Form 3 with standard normal options, 10 wells or less, doesn't the web form create a final presentation or PDF of the completed form?
It does. It sure does.
It does, but it will look different than some of the PDFs that you're used to.
And it, you know, I can tack on, since you're interested in the PDF, I can, maybe I'll do another presentation and get it posted in this, for this operator meeting. I have to do some work to make that happen, but to show you what the PDFs are going to look like. It essentially just lists all the information you've entered in the form. It looks like the form.
Oh, great. Thank you, Jane. I'm right now putting in the chat and I've just uploaded the PDFs of Jane's 2 presentations for your convenience today. So if you want to go to that link that I just dropped, then you can
Anna?
download that. Yeah, that's what I was doing, all that typing just a minute ago. And I was a little bit delayed. Let's see, operator meeting. Presentation. Okay, so there's 2 of them. One's the confidential information presentation. The other one's just the general presentation. And so you can click on those links and I believe download the PDFs of those right now if you want to. And then they'll be on the website later, but if you want them right this second, then you can have them right this second. We are capable of doing that now. Let's see. I don't see any more questions. But let me go ahead and put up my screen for the upcoming dates. So many screens. I thought I did it before, but I wasn't sharing. Okay. I'm still not sharing. So where are you?
Well, thank you, Jane and Chris. Great information today. And I know we've got beta testing that's going to happen this week. And so things are looking good, I think, and appreciate all your hard work on this.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good one. Thanks, Hannah.
Yep. Bye.
Thank you, Hannah.
Here's the dates for next one. And then if you guys need to be added to the operator meeting, you can just email me. And that's, well, give me a second to pull that up. There you go. There's my email address. So I'll leave that for just a few minutes and then we'll go ahead and call it. But thank you everybody for being here with us today. We appreciate it. Hope you have a good one. Bye-bye.